Hello. In this video, we're going to set up a basic Angular JS project using JSPM and JavaScript 6. First, we need to set up our project file and folder structure. So we'll open a terminal and go to the directory where we keep our projects. Then we'll use mkdir to create a folder structure. mkdir-p, and we'll call our project JSPM Angular, and inside of this folder we're going to create folders for client and server, and inside the client folder we're going to create a modules folder, and inside of that we're going to create folders for home and main. And you can check your directory structure by running tree. You should see your files or your folders laid out for you. We're going to add files to our folders, so we're going to cd into the JSPM Angular folder. We're going to use touch to create some files. So we'll start with server/app.js, and that's where we'll keep our server. Then we'll do touch client we'll add multiple, we'll do index.html and style.css. If you run tree again, you can see the files are being added to our project structure. Finally, we want to add the main and home files. So we'll do touch client main modules main, and we're going to add main.module.js, main.config.js, and main.controller.js. And that's for our Angular code. And we want to do the same with the home module. So we'll just press up and go here to change main to home. So home config, home controller, and we're going to add a home.tpl.html, and I end my HTML files with tpl.html because it's easier to find them in Grunt or Gulp or whatever I'm using to mess with my HTML files. So now if I type tree one more time, you can see my project structure is all set up. Next, we're going to initialize npm and JSPM. So we'll do npm init, and we'll just accept all the defaults. And then we will do we're going to install JSPM and Express. We'll do npm install save dev Express and JSPM. Okay, now that Express and JSPM have installed, we can initialize JSPM. So we'll type JSPM init, and we'll keep all of the defaults for this except for this one. The base URL needs to point to wherever the index.html lives. So for us, that's in our client directory, and we will be using the Babel transpiler. So that'll initialize JSPM. And then we can install Angular with JSPM. So we do JSPM install Angular. We'll install Angular UI router. And we're going to install a plugin called CSS, which will allow us to import our CSS files from our JavaScript rather than having to put links in our HTML file directly. So now we can create our Express server, and we want to open up Sublime Text. We can do that from the command line using the subl command, and you can either give it the name of a file or a folder. And since we're already in our JSPM Angular folder, we'll just give it a dot, and it will open Sublime Text in our JSPM folder. And you can expand the files out and see that our folder structure is all created for us. And we'll just create our Express server here. So I created a snippet that will create the server. It will run on port 20080 and serve our client directory. And if you're not familiar with Sublime Text, you can go to Tools and New Snippet, and you can define your own code snippets that you can just insert with shortcuts using Sublime Text. Now we can fill in our index.html file, and I have an HTML template for that. We will set this up for Angular. So we're gonna add ng controller to our HTML tag and give that a main control. Notice we're not adding an ng app here because we will have to manually bootstrap Angular later. In our title, we're going to do ng bind equals page title. We're going to add a div that is a UI view, and we have a JSPM block here. This is our system loader, and this will load our dependency files, and then it will load our JavaScript files and CSS files from our project. So all of this happens automatically, and we don't have to come back and add anything to our index.html after this. Okay, now we can define our main module. We'll start by importing Angular. Import Angular from Angular. So we're going to import from the Angular JSPM library that we installed, and we're going to get an object named Angular, and we'll reference, so we can have a reference to that in our code. And then we're going to import Angular UI router, and since we don't need a direct reference to that, we just import it. And what this does is tells the system loader to include the Angular UI router JavaScript file, but we don't actually get anything to reference it with in the code. So then we're also going to import our main config from this directory, main.config. You don't need to put the .js at the end because the loader will do that for you. Import main control from main.controller. And now we can build our module. We'll call it a const because we need a reference to it, so we need to make it a variable. So there's Angular module, and we'll call it main. It will depend on UI router, and we will give it a config object or config function, and that will come from main config, and we'll give it a controller. We'll call it main control, and that will come from our main control import. Now we want to export default main, and we're going to bootstrap Angular manually. So we'll do Angular dot element document. So get the document, listen for when it's ready, and then run a function. And we'll return Angular.bootstrap document. So this basically is the same as putting ng app in the HTML tag. And we'll pass an array main.name. And main.name is the same as this main right here. It's the name that you give your module. So now that looks good. and our main control is the main control ng controller that we passed in the HTML tag here, and that's our main module. Now we can define our main.config, and we will export default function. So we're just going to create a function. We'll name it main config, and we'll pass in URL router provider, and we're just going to say URL router provider dot otherwise, and we'll direct it to our home path. So that's just sets it up so that if you come into any non-existing URL, it'll just redirect you to the home URL. So now we can go to our main controller. We'll define that, and we'll do export default, and we'll make a class. We'll call it main control. And in JavaScript 6, classes have a constructor function, which is similar to init or any kind of code that would run whenever the file was loaded. So now you put that code into your constructor, and we'll pass it in a scope, and we will create the page title that we referenced in the index.html. So we're going to do let site name equals JSPM Angular project, and we're going to give our scope a page title, and we'll set that to the site name, and then we're going to update that whenever we change states. So we're going to go scope dot on state change success, and that comes with an event and a to state. And then we're going to say if our to state has a data object with a page title property, let's do this. Let's check if the data exists. So we'll say not equals null. That'll check for null and undefined. And then we'll say if the page title also not equals null, then we will say scope dot page title equals our to state data page title, and we'll append the site name onto that. So in our browser tab, we will have, for example, say home bar JSPM Angular project. Else, we'll just give it the default value of the site name. Okay, so that is our main controller, our main config. They're both being passed into our main module and being run there, and our main module is being bootstrapped whenever the document is ready. So our main control is assigned in index.html, and page title comes from our main controller. So that's how that all is wired together. Now we can go and start building our home module. And our home module is going to be a standalone module. So I like to build standalone modules instead of putting everything into the main module, so that it's easier to copy and paste modules into other projects that way, and for larger applications it's just easier to manage individual modules than it is to try to figure out how things are wired together into one huge module. So we'll do import Angular from Angular, and we'll import Angular UI router. And we already imported Angular UI router in our main module, so the loader is only going to load it once. But like I said, I like to make this standalone, so if I decide to copy this home module into another project, the dependency for Angular UI router would be met. I wouldn't have a bug or an error for it not being there. And then we're going to import our home config from this directory /home.config, and import home control from this directory /home.controller. And then we don't need a direct reference to this module, so we're just going to export it. Export default Angular module. We're going to name it home, and it's going to depend on UI router. And we're going to give it a config function, which is going to come from our home config. And we're going to give it a controller called home control. That's going to come from our home control import. And that's it for the home module. Now we will go to our home config, and we'll do export default function home config, and we're going to give this a state provider, and we're going to define our state. So we'll do state provider dot state, and we'll call it home. We'll give it a URL of /home. We'll give it the views, the default view, and we'll give it a controller of home control. We're going to use controller as. We'll call that home, and we'll give it template URL to our, so the template URL is going to point relative to your index HTML. So the path has to start wherever your index HTML is. So this will go to modules /home/home.tpl.html. And then in our views, after views, we're going to give it a data object, and we're going to give that a page title of home. So this data page title is the same data page title that's here in our main controller, and I forgot to put ands in there. So this toState.data title, that comes from here. So our state.data.page title would be home. Okay, now we can define our home controller, and we'll export default class home control, and our constructor doesn't have any arguments. We're not going to give it scope because we're using controller as. So we'll just say this dot title equals testing home dot controller. Okay, so Then we can go to our HTML template and we'll just give it a simple home tag, and we will get our home.title. So home.title, home comes from our config controller as, that's where we get home from, and home.title is put on this .title. So this is this controller as home. It's all sitting in there. And now we want to include our home module in our main module. So we have to go back to main module, and we will say import home from, and we'll give this an absolute path starting at index. We go modules /home/home.module. And then down here in our dependencies, we'll just say home.name. And that home.name is the same as whatever we named our module. Okay. Now we can define our style.css. So we'll just create a background, give it a gray background, and then to import our style.css, we will go to the main module and just import. We'll say style.css, and we'll put a exclamation point at the end so that it doesn't append a .js to it. The loader, that tells the loader that this is actually a .css file, not a JavaScript file. So it'll load it that way. So now we can start our server and check out our results. So we're going to load our page at localhost 20,080, and there you go. It redirected us to the home URL and loaded our home module for us. No errors. Everything looks good. All right. That is a basic Angular project set up with JSPM. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment below.